day in science, she had a further odd experience. Everyone filed into the classroom with their bags slung over their backs, finding their designated seats around the room. The usual chatter and laughter. Some guy with a Walkman around his neck, removed headphones from his ears. You could hear the drum-popping rhythmic garble from across the other side of the room. Mr. Davidson, the science teacher, entered the classroom carrying a large sack, which surprisingly only caught the attention of a few students towards the front of the room. He called for quiet, once offhandedly, the second time more convincingly. Everyone began to settle as more and more had noticed the sack he was carrying. Rachel read across the periodic table of the elements chart that was displayed at the far end of the classroom. AU, gold. PB, lead. Why not LE? The mother sow grunted to her babies as she eased herself down in the sweet straw at the back of the pen. There was a small corrugated iron enclosure at the back. It provided some relief of the sun and a very small amount of protection from the cold. The old pig's tough, scaly, hairy exterior, though, was a welcoming relief to her 12 piglets as they responded to her call, and each found their rightful place at her nipples. They all had a nominated teat right from birth, and they instinctively knew which one was theirs. The old sow gazed out through the mesh and bars that made up her pen, as her grunting, suckling infants jostled at her belly to get their fill. The air was clean and crisp and the stars were shining brightly. There was a nip in the air already. There was no doubt that there would be a crack of a frost in the morning. The grunting was gradually replaced by squealing as the piglets, now satisfied of their hunger, vied for the closest and warmest spot along the old pig's body. They sought any warmth they could obtain in which to spend the cold, frosty night. Finally, contentment came over the sty, and apart from the occasional grunt or snort, it was, for the most part, quiet. The morning came with the early morning sunshine streaming into the shed. Vapours of steam arose from the first sun-warmed patches on the ground, as the icy covering gave way its grip on the world to the approaching warmth of the day. The farmer crunched his way along the frosted track in a large, floppy pair of water boots. They were coated up to the ankles with a dried mixture of mud and pig excrement from the day before. He settled the 2 large buckets of sodded grain down at the sty gate, preparing to lift them over the pen panels and fill the troughs on the ground at the base of the fence. The old sow heard the familiar rattle of the bucket and heaved a huge, ugly body up and out of the straw. She waddled stiffly out to the trough, her large udders swaying with the swing of her gait. The piglets followed her out into the cold, bright morning and began to fight for the best spot at the trough. There was no spot allocated at the trough, unlike the teats. It was survival of the fittest, or roughest, or biggest. You just had to push in. The farmer passed his concerned gaze over the pen. 3, 4, 6 piglets. Where were the others? He made his way through the sty gate into the shed at the back. There in the straw were the tiny pink and blue bodies of the remaining 6 piglets. It must have been so cold during the night that when the old sow had adjusted her sleeping position, she had laid over on these 6, crushing the life out of them. He grabbed a sack from a nearby shed and placed their tiny, lifeless bodies into the bag. The sow grunted contentedly as she munched the grain with her head tilted back in the air, so as to help to tip the food down her neck, spraying sodded grains of barley all around her. Blissfully unaware of the catastrophe she had just caused to befall half of her offspring. The other piglets, uncaring, probably would have even been happy if they'd realised that this was a reason for the reduced competition at the trough. He made his way back down to the house with the sack. He rang his neighbour, a science teacher at the local high school. He had inquired before that if there were any tragedies such as this, his class might be given the chance to benefit by being able to dissect the body in the name of anatomy. "Right, class," cracked Mr. Davidson's squeaky voice. "Today we have something different for you all to turn your attention to." He explained how a neighbour had donated the unfortunate piglets to the class in the name of science, and today, much to the squeals of horror from a lot of the girls, or comments of "cool" from many of the boys, they would be splitting into groups to do autopsies on the bodies. Rachel snapped back to reality after observing the plight of the piglets in her vision. She took her place with the other 5 students at one of the desks that had been covered with green drop sheet. Scalpels and other instruments were laid in trays ready for the procedure. 2 of the guys in her group were fighting over who was going to cut its guts open. Mr. Davidson called for someone from each group to come to the front and collect the dead piglet allocated to their table. Rachel went straight away to collect the cadaver. She reached into the sack without so much as a thought. The tiny, ice-cold, limp piece of skin and hair she observed upon removing her hand from the sack shocked her. The little piglet was perfect in formation, its large ears, curly tail, and delicate snout, all intact, gave the piglet the look that it could still be alive and merely sleeping. But its eyes, slightly open, glazed over and dry, no longer moist but dusted by the previous contents of the sack, told the truth. It was dead, cold, gone. She walked slowly back to her table, holding the piglet close to her. The tears had welled in her eyes, and she tried not to look at anyone directly, in case they noticed and teased her for her weakness. She passed by the window on her way back to her table. She stopped momentarily to look outside and collect herself before she faced her group. She surveyed the world outside the window. Isolated from the cold outside air by the heat of the building's air conditioning, she still felt a shiver as she observed the grey clouds that covered the sky, the bleak, stark look of daylight that lit the world, but not directly, as it had to filter through the clouds first. She wondered if the old sow in her vision had noticed her missing babies yet, whether she found it strange now that only 6 of her teats would be used at feed time. She wondered if the pig felt at all sad as Rachel did for the untimely death of the little pig. The overwhelming emotions of sadness and pity flowed through her like an energy, making her head buzz and her arms feel weak. She could feel one of her daydreams beginning to take hold of her. Even though she knew how obvious it was going to be to lapse into a trance in the middle of a class full of people, she could not force herself away from the window. The colours were almost too bright for her to look at, flashing and strobing until it was almost impossible to separate them. They then changed from being colours into a blur of light. The light was blinding, and she tried to close her eyes tighter, using her forearm to shield herself from the glare, but it went straight through her. "Rachel!" The colours began to separate again. "Rachel!" She pulled her arm back down by her side. "Rachel, let go of it!" shrieked Mr. Davidson. She turned and looked at the distraught teacher. He was trying to pry the wriggling, squealing piglet out from under her arm. "It mustn't have been as crushed as the others and just got cold," he said with a shaky voice as he placed the terrified piglet back into the sack. She'd been standing there for 10 minutes, unaware that the piglet had been squealing and struggling for freedom for the past 5 minutes. No wonder Mr. Davidson looked unsettled. She went to the school sick bay. Her mum came and collected her soon after. They drove home in silence.